Nobody warns you about this moment. Nobody prepares you for the day you finally stop. The day you put down everything you were carrying, all the forgiveness, all the patience, all the love you kept pouring into someone who never once asked if your cup was empty, and you simply walk away. No drama, no final speech, no last attempt to make them understand, just silence, just you leaving. And the moment you do, something happens on the other side of that silence that most people never get to understand. Something that the narcissist in your life will never admit to. Something that the psychology books explain in cold, clinical language, but that nobody ever describes the way it actually feels. The way it tears through them, the way it unravels them from the inside out. Something that, if you knew about it, would finally give you the peace you have been searching for. That something is this. When an empath walks away, the narcissist's psychological hell begins. And today, we are going to go deep into that hell. Not to celebrate someone else's suffering, not to get revenge through understanding, but because you deserve to know the truth about what your presence meant, what your absence does, and why walking away from someone who treated you as an emotional resource rather than a human being is not just the right thing to do, it is the most powerful thing you will ever do. Let's start where it always starts, with you. You are not a weak person. Let's be absolutely clear about that from the beginning. Empaths are not weak. They are not naive. They are not broken. They are, in fact, some of the most emotionally sophisticated people on the planet. You feel things deeply. You read people intuitively. You walk into a room and immediately sense what is unspoken, what is unresolved, what someone is carrying beneath the surface of their smile. That is not a flaw. That is a form of intelligence that most people spend their entire lives trying to develop and never fully reach. But here is what no one tells you about that gift. It also makes you a target. Not because you were foolish, not because you made a mistake, but because the narcissist, the kind of person who builds their entire psychological existence around extracting emotional energy from others, can sense your capacity from a mile away. They are drawn to your warmth, the way a dying fire is drawn to oxygen. They need what you have. They cannot generate it themselves. And so consciously or unconsciously, they attach themselves to you and begin to feed. This is not a metaphor, this is psychology. What the narcissist feeds on has a name: emotional supply. And before you can truly understand what happens when you take that supply away, you need to understand what it actually is and why it matters so much to them. Because most people think the narcissist just wants attention. They think it is about ego, about vanity, about someone who simply likes being praised. And yes, admiration is part of it, but emotional supply goes so much deeper than that. Think about what it means to have a stable sense of self, to wake up in the morning and know who you are, to face criticism without collapsing, to sit with your own thoughts without spiraling into anxiety or rage. Most people have this, not perfectly, not always, but they have a foundation, a core sense of identity that can weather discomfort and survive solitude. The narcissist does not have this. Behind the confidence, behind the charm, behind the carefully constructed image of someone who has it all together, there is a terrifying emptiness, a fragile, unstable core that can only feel real, only feel significant, only feel safe when someone else is confirming it from the outside. That is what you were doing every time you listened, every time you forgave, every time you tried to understand, gave the benefit of the doubt, made excuses for their behavior, absorbed their moods, reflected back their greatness. You were not just being a good partner, you were being their psychological infrastructure. You were the scaffolding around the building that without you would have crumbled long ago. And you did it because you are an empath. Because when you love someone, you love them completely. Because you saw something in them. Maybe something they showed you deliberately, and you believed in the possibility of who they could be. You poured yourself into that belief. You made yourself smaller to make space for them. You silenced your own needs to attend to theirs. You mistook their hunger for love, when really it was just hunger. This is the part that breaks people when they finally see it clearly. Not the realization that they were used, as devastating as that is, but the realization of how long they allowed it, how many times they went back, how many red flags they painted green with their own hope, how much of themselves they gave to a person who was not capable of receiving it, not really, not the way you needed to be received. But here is the truth that lives on the other side of that pain. The moment you see it, truly see it, not just intellectually understand it, but feel it in your bones. Something shifts, the grip loosens, the fog begins to clear, and you start to understand that walking away is not giving up. It is not failure. It is not cruelty. Walking away from an emotionally extractive relationship is the first genuinely self-aware thing you can do. It is clarity dressed in courage. It is the moment you stop performing love for an audience of one who is never truly watching you, only watching what you could give them. And when that moment comes, when I'll finally quietly, completely walk away, that is when their world starts to fall apart. Here is what they will never show you. They will not call you crying at 2 a.m. and say, "I think I am falling apart without you." They will not sit with a therapist and admit that losing you exposed something they have spent decades running from. They will not post something vulnerable on social media about how empty they feel now that you are gone. They will not knock on your door and say the words you always wanted to hear, that you were right, that they were wrong, that they finally see the damage they did, and they are genuinely, deeply sorry. They will not do any of that. And if you have been waiting for it, if some part of you has been holding space for that moment of acknowledgement, I need you to hear this clearly. The absence of that moment is not evidence that they are fine. It is evidence of something far more significant. It is evidence that what is happening inside them is so overwhelming, so threatening to the identity they have built, that showing it to you or to anyone is simply not possible. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because what happens inside the narcissist when you leave is not grief the way you experience grief. It is not sadness. It is not the quiet, aching loneliness of missing someone you loved. What it is, what psychology actually identifies as the core experience, is destabilization, a fracturing of the constructed self, a sudden violent removal of the external support system that was holding their entire sense of reality together. Think of it this way. Imagine you have been wearing a prosthetic limb your entire adult life, not because you lost something, but because you never developed the real one. You learned to walk with it. You learned to function. From the outside, no one can even tell, but the moment that prosthetic is removed, you cannot stand. You cannot move. The absence reveals the deficiency that the presence was always masking. That is what you were to the narcissist. Not a partner, not a person they chose to build a life without of genuine love and mutual desire. You were the prosthetic, and now you are gone. The first thing that happens is panic, not the kind of panic they will let you see, not even necessarily the kind they are consciously aware of. But underneath the surface, underneath whatever performance they are putting on for the world in the hours and days after you leave, there is a physiological, psychological alarm response firing at a level that is genuinely difficult to describe. The nervous system, which had calibrated itself entirely around the steady stream of validation you provided, suddenly has nothing to regulate against. The input it was designed to receive has been cut off, and the result is internal chaos that manifests as agitation, restlessness, an inability to focus, a low-level but persistent sense of dread that they cannot name and therefore cannot address. This is what researchers sometimes refer to as narcissistic injury, and it is not a small thing. When the primary source of narcissistic supply is abruptly removed, the psychological response can be as intense as withdrawal from a physical substance. The body genuinely reacts. Cortisol spikes, sleep is disrupted, appetite changes, concentration breaks down. And because the narcissist has never built the internal emotional architecture to process these feelings in a healthy way, because their entire coping strategy has always been to extract regulation from others rather than develop it within themselves, they have no tools for what they're experiencing. They are flooded, and a flooded narcissist is a dangerous, unpredictable, deeply revealing one. This is when you typically see the behavior that confuses people the most. The behavior that makes you question everything, the sudden surge of affection, the texts that arrive at unexpected hours, the apologies that sound more real than anything they ever said when you were together, the grand gestures, the promises of change, the invoking of shared memories with a tenderness that feels genuine, that pulls at something deep in your chest, that makes you think maybe this time is different. Maybe the leaving is what finally broke through. Maybe the loss of you is what finally made them see. This is called hoovering. And understanding what it actually is, not what it feels like, but what it functionally is one of the most important things you can do to protect yourself in this moment. Hoovering is not love. It is not even really about you. It is a supply-seeking behavior. It is the narcissist psychological system recognizing that the source of its regulation has been removed and sending out every available signal to recover it. The warmth is real in the sense that the need behind it is real. But the need is not for you as a person. The need is for what you represented, for the stability your attention provided, for the mirror you held up that showed them the version of themselves they could only see through your eyes. They are not reaching out because they miss you. They are reaching out because they miss the version of themselves that only existed when you were there. And if you go back, if the hoovering works, nothing changes. The pattern resumes almost immediately. The warmth recedes, the dynamic restores itself because the root issue was never the relationship. The root issue was never communication or timing or circumstance. The root issue was a fundamental inability to meet you as an equal, to regulate themselves without consuming you, to love without taking. And no amount of pain from your absence rewires that. Pain alone does not create change. Pain plus accountability plus sustained willingness to do the deep internal work creates change. And that combination is extraordinarily rare in this personality structure. So the hoovering fails, or you do not respond, or you respond and go back and then leave again, this time with more certainty, and the panic deepens. What comes next is the stage that people talk about the least, perhaps because it is the least visible from the outside. The rage has quieted. The hoovering has stopped or been refused. And what remains, sitting beneath all of it, finally impossible to drown out, is something the narcissist has been running from since long before they ever met you. Silence. Their own silence. Their own company. Their own reflection in the absence of any mirror at all. And that, more than anything else, is where the real psychological hell begins. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a relationship with a narcissist. You have probably felt it yourself. That strange, disorienting quiet that settles in after the chaos finally stops. After the arguments, the cycles, the emotional whiplash, the constant low-level anxiety of never quite knowing which version of them you were going to get today. When all of that noise disappears, the silence can feel almost unbearable at first, not because you miss the chaos, but because the chaos, as destructive as it was, had become the rhythm of your life. And rhythm, even a painful one, is a form of familiarity, and familiarity, even a toxic one, is a form of comfort. But here is what you need to understand. That silence you're sitting in right now, they're sitting in it too, and for them, it is not just uncomfortable. It is catastrophic. Because you were not just their partner, you were their noise. You were the constant hum of external input that kept their internal world from becoming too quiet, too still, too honest. Every conversation you had, every reaction you gave, every moment of attention, positive or negative, it did not matter, was sound, was signal, was proof to their nervous system that they existed, that they mattered, that the story they were telling about themselves was real. You were the audience their performance required, and now the theater is empty. And in the silence of an empty theater, a performer has nothing to do but stand alone on the stage and finally, terrifyingly, look at what is actually there. What the narcissist finds in that silence is not what they expected. They expected to be fine. They always expect to be fine. The narrative they carry about themselves, the one that required your constant participation to maintain, insists that they are resilient, that they are exceptional, that they are the kind of person who does not need anyone. That is the story. And for a while, maybe they believe it for a few days, maybe a few weeks. They lean into it, they go out, they perform wellness, they post the photos that suggest they are thriving, They find someone new to talk to, someone new to reflect their greatness back at them, because the supply chain must be restored as quickly as possible, and almost any source will do in the immediate aftermath. But the substitute does not work the way they need it to. Not fully, not the way you did. And this is something that is rarely talked about in conversations like this. One, so I want to stay here for a moment because it matters. The narcissist does not just need any supply. They need attuned supply. They need someone who knows them or believes they know them deeply enough to provide the specific quality of validation that actually soothes the specific shape of their wound. A stranger can offer admiration. A new partner can offer attention. But what you offered after months or years of learning the precise architecture of their insecurity was something far more targeted. You knew exactly how to reassure them. You knew the right words, the right tone, the right moments to affirm them. You had been trained, often without realizing it, to be the perfect regulator for their particular emotional system. A replacement cannot do that, not immediately, maybe not ever. And so even with new distractions in place, even with fresh sources of attention being pursued, there is a quality of emptiness that persists, a hollow resonance where your specific presence used to be. And that hollowness forces something that the narcissist has been architecting their entire life to avoid. It forces them inward. Now, what they find when they go inward, when the distractions thin out and the quiet becomes undeniable, takes us back further than your relationship, further back than the person you met. It takes us back to where this all began, because the narcissistic wound is never really about the present. It is always, at its deepest level, about the past. Most psychological research on narcissistic personality development points to a common origin. Not a single traumatic event necessarily, but a pattern, a childhood environment in which the developing self was either chronically overvalidated, praised not for who they were, but for what they performed, loved conditionally based on achievement or image, or chronically undervalidated, emotionally neglected, made to feel that their authentic self was not enough, not safe, not lovable as it naturally was. In both cases, the child learns the same lesson through different means. The real me is not acceptable. The real me must be hidden. What I need to survive is to become something that other people will approve of, admire, reflect back to me as worthy. And so they built a self that was not real. Why a self? They built a performance, a character, a carefully constructed identity, designed entirely around securing external approval and avoiding internal exposure. And they have been maintaining that construction every single day since, feeding it, protecting it, finding people like you, who would participate in sustaining it without asking too many questions about what was underneath. You leaving did not just remove a partner. You removed the primary architect of their constructed reality. And now they are alone with the thing they built. And they can feel, for the first time in perhaps a very long time, how hollow it is, how it has no floor, how if they press on it even slightly, there is nothing solid underneath. The identity that felt so real, so total, so unquestionable when you were reflecting it back, it flickers without you. It wavers. It loses resolution. And in those moments of flickering, something surfaces that the entire structure was built to contain: shame, not guilt. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am something bad. And the distinction matters enormously here because guilt is workable. Guilt can motivate change. Guilt is the emotion that says, I hurt someone and I need to make it right. But shame is paralytic. Shame turns inward and becomes either collapse or aggression, either a spiral into self-destruction or an explosive redirecting outward, finding someone or something to blame. So the unbearable feeling of fundamental inadequacy does not have to be sat with for a single second longer than necessary. This is why the narcissist behavior after you leave can swing so violently between extremes. One day they are sending messages that sound like genuine remorse. The next they are telling mutual friends that you were the problem, that you were unstable, that the relationship failed because of your inability to handle someone successful and confident. One day they seem broken. The next, they seem fine, better than fine, almost aggressively okay, as if happiness were a performance aimed directly at you. This is not randomness. This is the oscillation of a person bouncing between the shame they cannot face and the defense mechanisms they have spent a lifetime perfecting. And here is where your understanding of this needs to shift in a direction that most content about narcissism never takes you. Because it is very easy and very human to watch all of this unfold and feel a complicated mixture of things. Vindication? Yes. Finally, the evidence that you mattered, that your absence has weight, that you were not imagining the depth of what was happening between you. But also, perhaps something softer, something that your empathy produces automatically without your permission. Something that looks at the image of this person alone with their shame and their hollow self, and their inability to find in anyone else what you gave them, and feels something close to compassion. I am not going to tell you that feeling is wrong. It is not wrong. It is, in fact, one of the clearest signs that you are exactly who you always were. Someone capable of profound, genuine human compassion. That capacity is not your weakness. It is your wholeness. But compassion does not require proximity. Understanding does not require return. You can hold space for the reality of another person's suffering without walking back into the fire to try to soothe it. You can acknowledge that they are in pain without accepting responsibility for that pain. You can see them clearly, fully, humanly, without demonizing them, and still choose yourself, still hold the boundary, still stay gone. Because the truth is this, their psychological hell is not something you created. It is something they built brick by brick long before T ever met you. You did not cause the wound that drives them. You were just the latest and perhaps the most effective person recruited to cover it. And when you stopped covering it, when you put down that weight and walked away, you did not create their collapse. You just finally stopped delaying it. And in that act, in that quiet, difficult, extraordinarily brave act of choosing yourself, you did something else too. Something that took enormous courage and that deserves to be named out loud. You started healing. Let's talk about you now. Not them. Not their collapse, not their panic, not the psychological unraveling happening on the other side of your silence. You have understood that now. You have seen it clearly. And understanding it was important, not as a weapon, not as a source of satisfaction, but as a closing of the loop, as the final piece of context that allows you to stop questioning yourself, to stop replaying the relationship, looking for the moment you went wrong, to stop carrying the weight of their dysfunction as if it were evidence of your inadequacy. You did not fail that relationship. You survived it. And now, right now, in this strange and tender and terrifying space on the other side of walking away, the most important work of your life is beginning, not the work of understanding them. That chapter is closing. The work of understanding yourself, of returning to yourself, of excavating the version of you that existed before you learned to make yourself smaller, quieter, less demanding, less visible in order to keep the peace in a dynamic that was never truly peaceful to begin with. This is what nobody tells you about leaving a narcissist. Everyone talks about the difficulty of getting out. Everyone talks about the trauma bond, the addiction-like pull of the cycle, the way your nervous system learned to associate their unpredictability with love. And those things are real and they are worth understanding. But what does not get talked about nearly enough is what happens after the leaving. What happens in the weeks and months when the adrenaline of the exit fades and you are left standing in the quiet of your own life, looking at the person in the mirror and realizing with a mixture of grief and wonder that you do not entirely recognize who is looking back because they changed you, not permanently, not irreversibly, but relationships like this one leave marks. They leave patterns. They leave a recalibrated nervous system that learned through repetition and conditioning to scan constantly for threat, to brace for disappointment, to interpret kindness with suspicion and silence with dread. They leave a voice in your head that sounds like your own, but carries their words, the criticisms, the dismissals, the subtle and not so subtle messages that your needs were too much, your feelings were too intense, your love was somehow simultaneously not enough and too suffocating. That voice is not yours. It was never yours. And one of the most profound acts of reclamation you will ever perform is learning to distinguish between the two. Here is what genuine healing from this kind of relationship actually looks like. Not the version that gets sold to you in motivational quotes, but the real version. The one that is slower and messier and more non-linear than anyone wants to admit. It starts with grief, real grief. Not just for the relationship, not just for the person you thought they were, but for the time, for the version of yourself that existed during those years. The one who was trying so hard, who loved so fully, who kept believing and forgiving and returning, and who deserved so much better than what they received. Grief for the future you imagined that will not happen. Grief for the energy you poured into something that could not hold it. This grief is not weakness. It is not you being unable to move on. It is the appropriate emotional response to a real loss. And if you skip it, if you rush past it into anger or numbness or the performance of being okay, it will wait for you. It will find you later in quieter moments, in new relationships, in the way your body tenses when someone raises their voice or goes suddenly silent. Let yourself grieve, fully, without a timeline. Then comes the work of understanding your patterns, not with self-blame, that is not what this is, but with genuine curiosity, because the narcissist did not choose you randomly. They chose you because of specific things you carry. The deep empathy, yes, but also often the particular brand of wound that made their dynamic feel familiar rather than foreign. The research on this is consistent and important. Many people who find themselves in relationships with narcissists grew up in environments that taught them in some form that love was conditional, that affection had to be earned, that the way to keep someone close was to attend relentlessly to their needs while quietly setting your own aside. If any part of that resonates, if there is a version of that story somewhere in your history, then the relationship you just left was not an accident. It was a repetition, a reenactment of something older, something that predates them entirely, something that your psyche was trying to resolve by finding a familiar dynamic and hoping this time for a different ending. This is not your fault. Patterns like this form below the level of conscious choice. You did not walk into this with full information. You walked into it with a heart that was wired by experience and by nature to love in a specific way. And that wiring was exploited by someone who recognized it before you recognized it yourself. But UT here is the power in that understanding, because once you see the pattern, truly see it, name it, trace it back to its origin, it loses its automatic grip. You stop being the person who unconsciously recreates